Back again. What's going on, everyone? 415ers podcast, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday on the Odyssey Sports Podcast Network. Evan Giddings and Marc Randy, as always. Download, rated, subscribe. 5 stars are appreciated. Also, go follow us on social media, on Twitter and on Instagram. We're online at the 415ers. And with that out of the way, Marc, how are you doing, good sir? How is your bye week going?
I'm doing well. I was just going to mention the Niners may be on a bye. They don't have a game this weekend, but we're not taking a bye. We're still rolling out 3 episodes a week, so keep it locked to the 415ers.
Oh, this is what we do. We got a lot coming up on the show. We're going to take a look at some of the teams that are playing this week
Yeah.
that will affect the 49ers. We're going to take a look at maybe a little bit down the line as far as what the 49ers could and could not be come postseason time, a place where everyone hopes they can get to, of course, this year. But where we want to start today, Marc, is kind of a little bit of where we left off in the last episode with the quarterback, because Jimmy Garoppolo had a birthday on Wednesday and turned 31 years of age. And this is kind of an interesting situation, I think, for a lot of quarterbacks, because I was just taking a look at, average age of quarterbacks throughout the years. And I feel like the older QBs in the league, like, the Tom Brady's going back a couple of years, the Roethlisbergers, maybe the Rivers, even before that, the Breezes. I guess Matt Ryan technically is in that category right now because he's pretty old, although he's on his way out. We think about quarterbacks, I think, having a long shelf life in the league compared to where it used to be. And so I just figured we'd kind of not even tiptoe, just ask the question, like, how are Jimmy Garoppolo's years in the future going to be compared to his years in the past? Because right now he's got a Super Bowl and 2 conference championship games on his resume. And I just figured I'd throw that one at you and say, like, at age 31, do you feel like he's got better football ahead of him, or has he played his best ball?
It's an interesting question because at 31, you're kind of at, that tipping point where maybe things tend to wind down a little bit. But as you mentioned, there's a lot of examples of quarterbacks playing well into their 30s, and then maybe a couple of examples of into their 40s. I think this conversation ultimately comes down to one thing, and that is whether or not in the future Jimmy Garoppolo is a San Francisco 49er. I think the way that Kyle Shanahan has developed a scheme around Jimmy Garoppolo's strengths really shows him off and does as good of a job as anyone could in making Jimmy Garoppolo comfortable and in allowing his strengths to shine through. Now, there'll still be moments where it's frustrating. You wish that, Kyle Shanahan maybe calls for more, but I think if Jimmy Garoppolo is a 49er for more than just this season, that's a gigantic if. It seems like the only way that that's possible is if this team wins the Super Bowl. I mean, how are you going to say no to your, Super Bowl winning quarterback who just led you to your 6th ever championship instead of, going to your young quarterback who you haven't seen much of so far? That would seem to be the only way it's going to happen. But when you consider that Christian McCaffrey's now on this team, Deebo Samuel's on this team. I mean, these are players who I think are perfect fits for what Jimmy Garoppolo does best. It's the quick passing game, it's accuracy, within 10 yards of the line of scrimmage. It's getting the ball in the hands of his, playmakers. And what playmakers in the NFL are more equipped to take a short pass, a short toss, a handoff, and turn it into a big gain than Christian McCaffrey and Deebo Samuel? I mean, those are the two of the most prominent examples of players that are great at that sort of thing. So I might be escaping the question a little bit in terms of Jimmy Garoppolo's ability himself, but I think he will not be as good as he is right now if he's playing on a different team in the future. So I think a lot of it comes down to where he is playing. I think he still has a lot of good football in him. But if we're seeing the best Jimmy Garoppolo, it's probably a combination of his own ability and also the scheme in which he's playing.
Yeah, I do think that for this season, there is a possibility there could be another level. I mean, I don't know how high it goes, but there's a possibility he could be playing better football, even maybe than he did in 2019, just because of the weapons that you mentioned. Like, I know 2019 had a great team around him, The offensive line was probably better. Up until they got McCaffrey, you could say the running game was probably better, but the wide receivers, the tight ends, like he's just got more weapons to use. So I feel like with Shanahan now also having more years under his belt, he could find a different level within that offense to kind of move up to. I do think though, like if we're just answering the question flat out, I think it's going to be very difficult for him to make two more conference championship games by the end of his career. Now, one of them could be this year. It could even be a Super Bowl appearance, perhaps. But I don't necessarily see him doing that anywhere else, kind of what you're saying outside of San Francisco. And at some point, the Niners are going to move off of him,
Yeah.
whether it's next year, whether it's year after. Like he's not going to be a lifetime 49er. So that would require him to kind of have a similar, type of year this year somewhere else, which I don't necessarily see. It's not out of the question, but I feel like it'd be very difficult for him to do that. Also, one thing too, I know I mentioned the amount of quarterbacks that are playing into their late 30s. A lot of them that I named are Hall of Fame or borderline Hall of Fame quarterbacks. That's obviously not Jimmy Garoppolo. I think people would agree with that. I also want to mention too, the average age of quarterbacks has been falling precipitously for about the last 10, 15 years. Like when Peyton Manning entered the league in 1998, I think it was, the average age of quarterbacks was like 30.1, which is kind of crazy to think about. There's a lot of older quarterbacks then. You got Steve Young, you got John Elway, you got guys in their late 30s that are playing and still productive, but also um, there was a lot more highly featured running games in the
Yeah.
NFL back then, whereas now it's more about the quarterback. And so that's why you're seeing the youth movement of teams being willing to take risks and bringing guys that do different things than just throw the football from the pocket. So the average age of quarterbacks as of last season was about 26, 27 years old. So that's a huge fall off from the last 20 years. And Jimmy Garoppolo is, of course, 31. I know you're saying that's kind of the tipping point, and I do agree generally for pocket passing quarterbacks because Jimmy is not a dynamic guy that can be a dual threat. But I just feel like at some point, I'm not necessarily on the bandwagon that he is going to be gone from San Francisco. Whether he's the starter or not is a different question. But this last offseason has kind of thrown my mind for a loop. So nothing's off the table.
Yeah.
But I do think that if we're going to answer the question of are his best days ahead or behind him, I don't see him making two more conference championships in his career, even if he gets one of them this season.
Well, yeah, and there's, I guess you could go a couple different ways in this conversation. You could go, is it solely about accomplishments? Because if he wins one Super Bowl, maybe that's enough to convince you. All right, well, this quote unquote second half of his career
Yeah,
is
that's true.
better. But it could also just you could take it as his personal play, kind of team accomplishments aside. Is he
But
better
isn't
now?
Jimmy G, hasn't he like always inextricably been linked to teams? Like that's his
That
whole thing, right?
That's true. It's kind of difficult, I think, with Jimmy to maybe separate those two than for other quarterbacks. Um, Also, quick aside on your age of the quarterback number there. Just imagine how far that number is going to drop when Tom Brady officially retires for a second time. Because I mean,
Well, that
he's the one of the guys that's just keeping it a little higher than it should be at what 45 years old.
yeah, and in fact, it's inflated quite a bit because of him.
Yeah.
So as soon as he leaves, I mean, well, that's why like okay, Roethlisberger leaves, drops.
Yep.
When Matt Ryan, I'm assuming is going to retire at the end of this year. I don't know who else would want him in the NFL.
He
Boom, that's going
should.
to take another hit. He should. If we're being honest, Tom Brady probably has some other things more worrisome in his life than football at this point. Whenever he decides to hang him up, boom. No, you're absolutely
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. Another thing I think about Jimmy Garoppolo that you need to consider with this conversation, and it's why I tend to agree with you that his best days are probably behind him, but I think he can still play at a relatively consistent level for a couple more seasons. But you also have to consider the fact that history tells us he's probably likely going to suffer an injury again at some point. I mean, it's just kind of what has happened in his career. He had those, five miraculous starts and wins for the 49ers the first year he was here when he was traded midseason from New England back in 2017. He went 5-0, and then he was the team's starter for sure from the start of the season in 2018 unfortunately tore his ACL in the third week of that season. Then came back in 2019 after rehabbing the injury, and the team, of course, went all the way to the Super Bowl. Following year, 2020, we know about that as well. He only made 6 starts. And then, of course, last year, up and down season, the team goes 9-6, ends up getting to the NFC Championship game. And now this year, he has dealt with injuries throughout the past, and generally, as a quarterback gets older, those injuries tend to happen more often. So it's not only about the quarterback's ability when they're fully healthy; it's about how often they can be fully healthy. And unfortunately, the reality is Jimmy Garoppolo has already suffered a number of relatively serious injuries, and as he gets older, those injuries tend to happen more often. So I think that's a portion of this conversation that needs to be considered as well. And I think it's why I tend to lean on the fact that if I were to bet what half of Jimmy Garoppolo's career would be more impressive, would be better, it would probably be the half that we've already seen.
Yeah, I would push back a little bit on the injuries just because there have been examples of quarterbacks that have sustained injuries later in their careers that have been able to bounce back. Like, I mean, Tom Brady tore his ACL at age 31. He obviously played for 15 more years, which is pretty crazy.
He's just the most
Peyton,
outlier of all outliers.
well, Peyton
Uh,
Manning missed a full season with a neck injury that you could say is not only, career threatening, but potentially life threatening. That happened at age 35, in which he missed the entire season and then came back to play, 3 or 4 more all pro seasons. So I don't necessarily, I mean, and Jimmy Garoppolo's injuries, to me, the one that would worry me the most would be the shoulder, just because that's something that doesn't necessarily fade. But like a torn ACL, the 2 fluke injuries, in my opinion, that he sustained have not necessarily been his fault. So I can't knock him for that. And I mean, look, even with the shoulder injury last year, he was still able to help the Niners get to a conference championship game. And so you could argue that maybe he's learned to kind of play with pain and play through pain. So I would push back on the injuries, even though I do think overall you're right.
one other quick note, which I think is interesting about that shoulder injury that you're talking about. I know I think I briefly mentioned this. I think it was after the Rams game, so the Sunday night Monday episode. It seems like Jimmy Garoppolo has improved throwing the deep ball this year, and I mean, it seems like he can throw it further, uh, harder, and generally with some more accuracy. And maybe I'm just imagining that, but you've kind of read some other things from various beat reporters. They're taking questions in mailbag, articles about it from the fans. There's a lot of people who kind of see the same thing, and it's probably not necessarily because his arm has somehow gotten stronger, or maybe that shoulder surgery fixed something that was previously wrong that maybe no one was aware of. Jimmy Garoppolo was asked early in the season about that shoulder surgery and how he, was working out in the offseason and what he was doing when he wasn't able to throw the ball. And he said it allowed him to focus more on his lower body and the strength in his legs and in his torso and all that. And he said that's probably why I feel better throwing the ball now, because I can throw it a little further, maybe with a little more juice behind it as well. So that's something that's interesting. Maybe he's learning a little bit more in terms of how to train and prepare his body as he gets older. Because I mean, maybe I'm just imagining it, but it does seem like he is throwing the ball with better accuracy deeper down the field. Now, it's still not fantastic. It's not on the level of Mahomes or Allen, of course. We talked a lot about that last episode, and I'm not saying that he's suddenly an elite deep thrower of the football, but he was pretty bad the last few years, and it seems to have gotten a little bit better this season.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, he was injured 2020, obviously. 18. I mean, 19 is really the only year we have to evaluate. That's the other part about Jimmy G that's kind of tough. It's like there's just not a large sample size. I mean, because the bad seasons you're kind of writing off due to injury. They didn't play enough, and then the one year that he is healthy in 2019, they go to the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
But the question is, all right, is he really the main focus? He's the quarterback. They win. I don't know. I do think that compared to last year, certainly, which is kind of the only successive seasons we have to go off of at this point, he is throwing the deep ball more. I mean, on average, like he's dialing up the deep ball, and I think Shanahan has done a pretty good job of scheming things open for him down the field, or at least scheming up plays with enough separation for Jimmy G to feel comfortable putting the ball in the air and putting it, whether it be in harm's way or to a an open wide receiver, an open tight end. He hit Ross Dwelly for 56 yards in the last game against the Rams. Those are the type of balls that he's going to be hopefully able to put more in the air. Not only because you'd like to see a quarterback move the ball down the field more, you pick up more chunk plays, but also I think it would help him in what he does do well, which is complete passes underneath within 10 yards of the line of scrimmage. If you're able to hit one or two down the field per game, then that's going to hopefully open up things where you are better and more efficient at. So to me, that's certainly something to take a look at.